Hello and welcome to the first of 8 lectures in the series Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This series is produced by Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, in cooperation with Third Age Learning KW. These lectures were presented at Rim Park in Waterloo between January 9th and February 27th, 2020. This lecture, Martin Luther Setting the Stage, is delivered by Reverend Dr. Mark Harris, Principal Dean of Martin Luther University College from 2015 to 2020.
I am delighted to be with you this afternoon and want to thank all of you for coming out on this cold, wintry day as we begin this series that is entitled Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. On behalf of my colleagues who will be presenting over the coming weeks, we're pleased that you've joined us in the exploration of the historical and the controversial figure of Martin Luther. But more than just looking at the man, over these coming weeks, we are going to be tracing the manner in which Luther's thought, that is, his way of understanding, contributed to the emergence of the modern era, both for good and ill. And indeed, the manner in which Luther's thought continues to influence the world today. Now, by virtue of having enrolled in this series, or at least coming to try us out today, I'd like to assume that everyone here has at least some passing acquaintance with Martin Luther. However, just to make sure that there's no confusion, the focus of the series will be on this person, Martin Luther, the Augustinian priest who came to be celebrated or vilified, depending on your point of view, as the father of the Protestant Reformation. Luther inaugurated a movement of reform that changed the Western Church and thereby the course of European history. We will not be talking about this fellow, Martin Luther King Jr., the African-American pastor who became a spokesperson and figurehead of the 20th century civil rights movement in the United States. For even though both of these were iconic figures who gave voice to the zeitgeist or the defining spirit or mood of their age, Martin Luther King was, it could be argued, an heir of the older Luther's insights. Martin Luther King Jr. is certainly worthy of a Third Age Learning series of his own, but that will have to wait for another occasion. Our series will focus on this figure, whose thought and lasting influence has been praised and criticized and celebrated and condemned for the last 500 years. Like all public figures, and indeed like all human beings, Luther was a man of his age and an individual of deep contradiction. He was both deeply gifted and deeply flawed. But in an era when the statues of historic figures are being removed from our public parks and their names are being removed from our institutions precisely because of their contradictions, why are we even looking at this man? Well, I'd like to suggest that there are two good reasons. The late historian Phyllis Tickle argued that we are even now at a turning point in history, a shifting paradigm, the magnitude and character of which will rival that of the Reformation era. I'd like to suggest that perhaps by exploring Luther, who played such a pivotal role in his own time, that we might be able to gain some insights into what is unfolding even now in the midst of our own lives. And the other reason I think he's worth looking at is that whether you are aware of it or not, we continue to be significantly influenced by Luther's thought today. For example, by a show of hands, how many of you believe in the importance of universally available public education? How many of you think that's important? You are an heir of Martin Luther. How many of you think that it's important for an individual to act according to his or her conscience, even if it means challenging the status quo? You're an heir of Luther. How many of you believe that it is important for a community to take responsibility for looking after its most vulnerable members? You are all heirs of Martin Luther. And so in this series, we want to explore not just the man, but the way in which his values and teachings continue to shape and influence our lives today. So, where do we begin? Next week, Dr. Robert Kelly is going to lead us into an exploration of Martin Luther's life and career within the context of the turbulent times in which he lived. However, in today's lecture, I would like to provide you with some important background as a way of setting the stage for next week's presentation and the entire series. Any of you who have ever purchased a home or other property have probably heard the familiar adage that when you're looking for real estate, there are three important things to think of: contact or location, location, and location, right? Similarly, if we want to understand Martin Luther, it's important to begin by considering his location. That is how Luther was situated within the wider context of the historical forces that were profoundly shaping Europe in his lifetime. Often in our recounting of history, we are tempted to consider the deeds of influential women or men as if they themselves held the key to their own influence. However, such a perspective fails to recognize the degree to which a context shapes the individuals who are within that context. It is not just the case that every era and setting has its own unique opportunities and challenges, but that these very conditions shape the individuals who are in them. Looking across this room, I suspect that almost all of us are individuals who were born and raised in the 20th century, mid-20th century, many, though not all of us, in a North American context. We have all been significantly shaped by being part of the post-war generation, shaped by the experiences of the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Liberation Movement, etc. But what is important for us to consider for the topic at hand is this. Occasionally, history calls forth individuals who are not just shaped by their context, but who are able to speak into it. That is to reframe or reshape the context in which they live by identifying the issues that define that era. And when that happens, these exceptional individuals may be known as the icons or the spokespersons of their age. As we stand at the beginning of this series, exploring the person and lasting influence of Martin Luther, it is crucial to begin by sketching out the broad social, political, economic, and religious forces that were shaping the Europe into which Luther was born, and from which he would emerge onto the public stage. For these are the forces who shaped who Luther was. But perhaps even more important, it was Luther's ability to address the underlying issues of his age. That is, to address the existential and theological issues that were bubbling and seething beneath the surface that contributed to his public appeal and his lasting influence through succeeding generations. Thus, for the balance of my presentation this morning, I would like to identify for you 5 major shifts that were shaping Europe of the late medieval period, the setting and stage in which Luther would rise to prominence. And while that list of 5 might be elaborated a little long, I will argue that it was the convergence of these forces which created the context that was not just ready, but which called forth the emergence of this reformer. So let's begin. As strange as it may seem, the place that we need to begin is almost 2 centuries before Luther's birth, when the Black Death, a form of bubonic plague, swept through Eurasia. Named for the manner in which it caused the fingers and toes to turn black because of the loss of peripheral circulation, the plague was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. Thought to have originated in the dry plains of Central Asia, the Black Death was carried along the trade routes of the Silk Road before reaching the Crimea, the area of the Black Sea, in 1344. From there, the disease was spread by fleas, living on the black rats that traveled on all merchant ships. And as these ships plied their trade around the Mediterranean and up the east coast of the Atlantic, they carried with them the rats that carried the fleas that carried the plague. And as these ships landed in port cities, they inadvertently spread the disease that made its way into nearly every city and village and hamlet in Europe. And what this map shows you is the progression of the plague between the years 1346, when it came into the Black Sea area, spread through the Mediterranean, up the coast of Europe, and into the very heartland. Since no one in that era understood what was causing this plague, the terror that spread across Europe was almost as infectious as the disease itself, and for good reason. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death is estimated to have killed between 30 and 60% of the population of Europe. Estimates are that numbered somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. The impact was so severe that it took over 200 years for the global population to recover the levels it has achieved before the Black Death. And as unimaginable as the human suffering must have been during this time, what is relevant to our topic are the social, economic, and political forces that came as a result of the massive decline in population caused by the plague. You see, late medieval Europe had largely organized itself into an agrarian economy that heavily relied upon the manual labor of serfs to generate wealth for the nobles and ruling class, who thereby drove a slowly growing trading economy. the loss of nearly half the labor force in a 5-year period was devastating. Farms that had been tilled for centuries went uncultivated. Landowners lost their source of agricultural income and could not pay their taxes. This financially crippled the ruling classes, who were further stretched because the labor shortages drove up wages. Socially, the lack of understanding as to the cause of this pestilence led to religious fervor and fanaticism that blossomed in the wake of the plague, as Jews, friars, foreigners, pagans, pilgrims, and Romani were targeted, thinking that they were to blame for the crisis. In recent years, climatologists have speculated that the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling across Europe in the 15th century that further compromised food production, was prompted, at least in part, by the reforestation of Europe caused by the loss of laborers available to till the land. But for our purposes, the most important thing to understand is this. The Black Death of the 14th century so disrupted the social, economic, and political fabric of Europe that it would never recover to its previous state. The depopulation prompted by the Black Death set in motion forces of change that would begin to profoundly reshape Europe. And if we are to understand the time and place wherein Martin Luther would become an influential figure almost 2 centuries later, it is crucial to understand the profoundly disruptive role that the Black Death played in giving rise to that era of change. If the precipitous loss of population prompted by the Black Death was the first historical trend upon which we focus our attention, the second and third historical trends which contributed to the setting of our stage really need to be understood in tandem. For they represent the dynamic balance of power that had existed for much of the Middle Ages, defining the relationship between the church and the temporal authorities. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Western Church, with the Pope at the center, had been at the heart of European society. Consequently, the papacy exercised significant influence upon the political affairs of states. However, the relationship between the authority of the Pope and that of the secular authorities had never been clearly defined or universally agreed upon. For example, Boniface VIII in 1302 declared, and I quote, "It is necessary to salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff." Thus, he was arguing for the complete subordination of the state to the church. And this reflected the medieval ideal of unifying all Christendom into a single political unity, with the church and the empire as its leading institutions, but with the church, in other words, the papacy, as the final authority. And that dynamic relationship, the tug and pull between the temporal authorities and the church, had been played out for centuries. However, in the era leading up to Luther and the Reformation, a series of events began to erode papal authority and shift the balance of power. The first of these was the Black Death that we just discussed. While the plague and its devastating impact upon the population of Europe prompted increased religious fervor among many, it also began to undermine the credibility of the church for many others. The inability of the church to provide an adequate response to the plague or explain why this pestilence had been visited upon Europe began to raise serious questions regarding the church and its proclamation. These murmurs of discontent were further enlarged by a series of events which became known as the Avignon Papacy. Following a period of conflict between the papacy and the French king, the death of the reigning pope gave the French the opportunity to force the election of a French pope in 1309. His name was Clement V. And when Clement was elected to the pontifical office, he refused to move to Rome. And instead, he relocated the papal court from Rome to Avignon, France, where it remained for the next 67 years. A total of 7 popes reigned at Avignon, and all of them were French. And during the 7 decades of the Avignon papacy, the curia's relationship with many of the other Western rulers became increasingly strained. One reason for this is that the French were seen as exercising far too much influence over the decisions of the papal court. In addition to this, papal efforts to extend its power of patronage in order to increase revenues competed with the interests of many of the nobility across Europe. And so, as a consequence of the Avignon papacy, it was not just that the center of the church had been relocated from Rome to France, but that the authority and the credibility of the papal office, and therefore the church, began to be further questioned in ways that had not previously been the case. The events which immediately followed the Avignon papacy only served to further erode the papacy, its authority, and raise questions about it. In 1378, Pope Gregory XI finally brought the papal offices back to Rome. However, Gregory died a very short time later. And the election of his successor, Urbain VI, turned out to be such a disaster that the College of Cardinals responded by electing another pope, Clement VII, even though Urbain was still alive. And this created a situation in which there were 2 legitimately elected popes who were simultaneously in office, vying each one of them for the support of the secular authorities across Europe. And this prompted the countries and territories of Europe to become a patchwork, divided among those who supported the Pope in Rome, those who supported the Pope in Avignon, and for a short time, those who supported a third Pope who raised in Pisa. That stalemate was known as the Western Schism. And while it was eventually resolved in 1407, with the single papacy being reestablished in Rome, the compounding influence of the Western Schism upon the papacy was undeniable. The combined consequences of the Black Death, the Avignon papacy, and the Western Schism had eroded the credibility and authority of the church. The implications of that might not have been significant had the wider environment of Europe been stable. But it was not. in a time when the social and political and economic systems of Europe were already disrupted. This set up a situation wherein a rebalancing of power and authority was inevitable. Now, if the beginnings of that rebalancing of power was underway, it was not just because of the limits to the growing or to the readily apparent limits to the authority of the papacy that was beginning to come into question. It was also because there were forces at play across Europe that were changing the political landscape, emboldening the temporal authorities to assert their political power and influence over against the papacy in ways that had not previously been the case. We need to recall that medieval Europe had been a constantly shifting kaleidoscope of political arrangements, where borders and alliances were constantly fought over and renegotiated. Power under the feudal system was based upon the military control of land, such that the feudal lords could claim the economic benefits from the land under their control, either directly or through the local nobility who were taxed in return for protection. But the depopulation of Europe, prompted by the Black Death, destabilized that whole state of affairs, triggering social unrest, economic decline, and endemic warfare across much of Central and Western Europe. Much of the 14th and 15th centuries was characterized by the conflicts that accompanied that renegotiation of power as the feudal system of governance broke down. This is what led to the peasants' uprisings in France and England, as well as the 100 Years' Wars. It was this renegotiation that contributed to the beginnings of the decentralization of power that had once been vested in the Holy Roman Emperor, as the prince-electors, that is, those who elected the emperor, began to claim more power and authority in their own territories, in their Germanic lands. Meanwhile, the economic consequences of the breakdown of the feudal system began to see a redistribution of wealth. The development of a concept of property that began to replace more ancient forms of jurisdiction, and the emergence of a merchant class. In short, the 14th and 15th centuries saw a shift in temporal power away from the feudal lords and to monarchs and common people. For it was during this era that territories were also beginning to consolidate and transform into the earliest antecedents of modern states. Thus, the power of the princes and nobles and lords, that is, the temporal authorities, were asserting and reordering themselves at the same time that the authority of the church and the power of the Pope was being challenged. And that's part of what informed the world into which Martin Luther would be born, and in which he would play such a crucial role. For this is a period of massive shift, characterized by the breakdown of the feudal system and the process of renegotiating and redistributing power and authority among the power brokers in Europe. But that's not all, because there were still other forces at play, serving to transform this era of time. Over this same period, the depopulation was compelling the reordering of the political and economic systems. And the balance of power between states and the ecclesial authorities was being renegotiated. A slow but growing momentum in learning was becoming another pivotal force that was reshaping the 14th and 15th centuries. And it was opening up not just new fields of knowledge and innovative ways of thinking, but it was giving rise to ways of thinking about the world and our place in it. And sometimes those innovations were coming from unexpected places. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, Western Christians had engaged in a series of crusades against their Muslim counterparts in the Middle East, primarily over control of the holy sites that were considered to be sacred by both groups. And without getting sidetracked by the historical debates about the Crusades, and there are many, what is relevant to our topic is this. One of the unexpected consequences of the Crusades and Western Christendom's exposure to the Arab world was the recovery of many of the Latin texts of the ancient philosophers that had been preserved in the Middle East but had been largely unknown in Europe. The recovery of those texts by the Crusaders prompted a search among the monastic libraries of Europe, which yielded a further treasure trove of ancient writings that had been lost or forgotten, sometimes for hundreds of years. And the impact of this influx of ancient but new knowledge was further compounded when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. For that forced many of the Byzantine Christian scholars to seek refuge in the West and to bring with them many of the ancient Greek texts that had also been similarly lost. It is hard for us to imagine the impact of the rediscovery of those ancient philosophers, or the contribution that their writings would make in fueling the changes that were beginning to transform the late medieval era. While many of these writings, these Latin and Greek texts, were widely received among the learned across Europe, these writings found a particularly receptive audience among the scholars and nobility in Florence, Italy, where the social, political, and economic conditions were such that it gave rise to a period of florescence and learning that we now refer to as the Italian Renaissance. This was a period known for its painting and architecture, sculpture, literature, music, philosophy, science, technology. But even more fundamentally, the Renaissance reflected an opening up of the imagination in Western thought. Precisely in a time when the disruption of the status quo was making it necessary, crucial, that new ways of thinking be found. And as the influence of the Renaissance spread north and across Europe, It gave rise to humanism, a whole new way of thinking about the world and humanity's place in it. But that's not all. Because new ways of thinking and knowing were enabling discoveries that further fueled the hunger for and the pace of change. This was the era of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. This was the time when Columbus, trying to find a short route to India, instead discovered an unknown continent, a new world. This was the era when Vasco da Gama linked Europe with the Indian subcontinent, opening up trade routes that had previously been unimagined. And when Nicholas Copernicus was beginning studies that would totally change humanity's understanding of their place in the universe. So it was not just that new fields of knowledge were opening up, but that new ways of understanding were emerging. Even as old systems were breaking down and being reconstituted in new ways, and old and trusted authorities were being challenged in ways that had never happened before. This was the shifting and dynamic context which not only formed, but from which Martin Luther would emerge into the public arena. And before I close the lecture, I need to add one more variable that quite literally changed the Western world and became a crucial element in the Reformation that Luther would ignite. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, the emergence of new technologies were transforming the ways of managing the traditional means of defense, production, and economic growth across Europe. This era saw the introduction in Europe of gunpowder coming from China, which transformed military power. This was a period which witnessed the invention of vertical windmills, spectacles, mechanical clocks, greatly improved water mills, achievements in building techniques which allowed for the construction of the first Gothic cathedrals, and improvements in agriculture which increased crop yields. There were also significant advances in maritime technology, including improvements in shipbuilding and navigation, making possible the dawning of the age of exploration. But among the many technological advancements of this era, there is one that stands out as being particularly relevant to our topic. Around the year 1440, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg invented a printing press with movable type. While woodblock printing had been known in China since the 8th century, and woodblock printing with screw presses had been used in Europe since the 1300s, Gutenberg's introduction of a movable type printing press was nothing short of revolutionary. And I need to repeat that. It is so important. His introduction of the movable type printing press was nothing short of revolutionary. Up until this time, the acquisition of knowledge and the distribution of information had been largely controlled by the church and the nobility. And the printing press changed all of that. The relatively unrestricted circulation of information and ideas made possible by the printing press allowed it to transcend borders and classes It allowed the first time ordinary people to engage in issues that had previously been beyond their reach. And the common people's access to the issues of their age challenged the established political power and religious authorities who had previously held a monopoly on this information. The printing press enabled easy access to written communication, which fostered an increase in literacy, thereby bolstering and strengthening the emerging middle class. Across Europe, the printing press increased the cultural self-awareness of peoples, as was exemplified by Luther's translation of the Latin Vulgate Bible into German. The access to the printing press accelerated the development of the European vernacular languages, to the detriment of Latin as the language of the church and the nobility. The access to language, vernacular language, and printing further reinforced the rise of emerging national identities. At the same time, as you will hear next week, the easy circulation of information made possible by the printing press became a major tool that was employed by Luther and the other reformers to sway public opinion and win the hearts and minds of their supporters. And this was the dynamic and the changing context into which Martin Luther was born, and from which he would emerge into the public arena. The world of late medieval Europe was giving way to something else. The whole paradigm of life was shifting or ordering as all facets of medieval life were changing. Old authorities were being challenged. Power was shifting. New ways of thinking were enabling discoveries which further fueled the search for new knowledge. New technologies were enabling the dissemination of information and the engagement of the nobility and masses alike in the issues that were beginning to reshape their world. And in the midst of that, people were asking new questions, theological questions, questions about what does it mean to be human in this changing context? Because the old answers just didn't seem adequate to respond to the questions of this changing world. What does it mean to follow one's conscience? What does it mean to exercise freedom over one's destiny? What is the relationship between church and state? What is my responsibility to my neighbor? What does it mean to be justified? Someone was needed who could speak into this dynamic and changing context, providing new language, new ways of understanding which would be appropriate to this new and changing world. In the coming weeks, you are going to hear how Martin Luther was one of the pivotal figures in re-articulating this emerging world. For while Luther's concern, as you will hear, was with the reform of the church, the consequences of what he started would impact not just the church, but the whole face of Europe. In fact, Luther's ideas would contribute to the emergence of the modern era itself. Next week, as I mentioned, Dr. Robert Kelly is going to lead us into an exploration of Luther's life and career in that turbulent era into which he was born. But in the following weeks, a number of other scholars will help us explore how Luther's thought continues to shape the way that we think about and understand the world today.
You have been listening to Martin Luther Setting the Stage, the first talk in an 8-lecture series titled Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This lecture series was presented at Rim Park in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, through January and February 2020 by Martin Luther University College and Third Age Learning KW. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like more information about Martin Luther University College and its programs, visit the school's website at luther.wlu.ca. And for more information on Third Age Learning KW and its upcoming lectures, visit the website at tal-kw.ca.